Hello everyone. My name is Margot Buckles. I am a volunteer with WASBA, and WASBA started this video session called Ask a Washington Beekeeper so that we could reach people who did not have the ability to have a mentor or go to a club. So right now we have Tim Hiatt with us, and I will let Tim introduce himself and talk a little bit about himself. But before I get started, I do want to remind everyone that we have tickets available for the upcoming WASBA annual meeting, annual conference, which will be the first weekend of October. We have a lot of great speakers available, and I'll try to put up the website at the end of this broadcast so that you can see it and potentially sign up. So, Tim, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do in Washington as a commercial beekeeper?
Hey, thank you, Margot. So my name is Tim Hiatt. I am a second generation beekeeper. My story goes back to 1968 when my parents quit being school teachers and bought a small beekeeping business in Ephrata in Eastern Washington. And they threw their hats in and just did that full time. And my mom's parents were uh, upset, I guess, that they would give up good paying teaching jobs. They were both teaching school to go off and do something that my grandparents thought was a hobby. But my dad had always made it his full time job. And so when I grew up, I was pretty much beekeeping with hundreds of hives was all I've ever known. And um, In fact, today in Washington State, there's maybe 40 large commercial beekeepers. And so before I got involved with WASBA, I was keeping these thousands of hives with my parents or my brothers and myself, thinking that, oh, there's only a handful of commercial beekeepers in the state. But then one day I was talking with Alan Woods, president of WASBA now, and he said, well, I'm a commercial beekeeper. And I thought, well, he has a store where he sells goods for beekeepers and buys and sells queens and packages and things. And yeah, I guess that is commercial, because commercial means you're doing commerce, you're buying and selling. And if you look at commercial beekeeper from the point of view of anybody who buys and sells bee stuff, the backyard beekeeper who sells a few nooks every year or sells extra queens, or you sell your honey at a flea market or at a farmer's market or something. Yeah, you're commercial too. So I was pleased to kind of have my vision expanded, that there's more than just a handful of big commercial beekeepers who come in to do the pollination. No, there's commercial beekeepers all over the state. Their size is what's different. And so, but I've never known what it's like to be a small beekeeper. When I was growing up, there was a couple small beekeepers where I was, and one of them was a butcher in the local Safeway, and he had about 500 hives that he kept on the side. And as he got older, I would help him harvest the honey, and he worked his regular butcher job, but he had these bees on the side, and it really worked well for him. Other people I've known that have had a few hives here and there, so it's been a lot of fun getting my point of view expanded. Um, so my experience with beekeeping has always been with larger numbers of bees. And then in the 90s, I became interested in the political aspect of it. I realized that beekeepers weren't being treated fairly when it came to taxation in Washington state. And so I approached the then president of WASBA, and he says, yeah, go ahead, you can be the legislative chair, you pursue this with the state. And so I did, and that's how I got to be the legislative chair, the beekeeper liaison with the legislature. And since then we've had a number of really good um, ideas come for the legislature. Many of them have passed. And I'm really happy that we've done such a good job. And I would be totally powerless as the legislative chair without the grassroots support, the folks at WASBA and beekeepers around the state who are willing to contact their legislators and rattle their cage about things that we want to see. The last thing we did was liability protection for beekeepers. Really good bill. It's unique in the nation, really. Sort of modeled on the West Virginia bill, but ours goes farther than theirs. It offers really good protection. So I was really happy that the legislators saw our point of view and went with it. So as far as being a commercial beekeeper, so yeah, I mean, back when I was a kid, my grandparents thought you can't make a living as a beekeeper. That's just a hobby thing. And actually, no, you do. You can spend a lot of time and money and effort and become self-sufficient by operating bees. You have to do it right, though. I read some of the local bulletin boards in the state, and a few times people post and say, "Oh, I should have gone to my bees this weekend, but I was busy, didn't get around to it." And the next weekend, I went to look at them, and a bunch of them swarmed, or a bunch of them came down with EFB, or whatever. And if you're trying to make a living on the bees, you can't afford to not be on top of things. So that's kind of one difference between just keeping bees for fun and making a living off of them. Is you have to really do your best to be on top of the bees and their needs. But I think there's really more in common with commercial beekeeping or so-called big beekeeping and folks who do it in their backyards for a pastime, because it's still just beekeeping, assuring that the bees have the feed when they need it, that they have a good queen, that they have sufficient stores for winter, that the diseases are all in control. It's the same thing, just more of it. So anyway, I'm here to answer questions, discuss how we do things on a large scale. We can talk about legislative stuff if we want. I'm open to any questions folks want to throw at me.
So Tim, why don't you tell people like what a typical day is like in the spring, in the summer, in the fall, and in the winter for you?
Okay. Well, in our beekeeping year, I guess, if you want to go by the calendar, all our bees are in California for the winter, and we are feeding corn syrup and pollen patties and getting their populations built up to go to almonds. So a typical day is checking bees all day, um, checking the state of the queen. In late January, early February, California, the queen will be laying, and you can see how if she's good or not. And then we go to the almonds in February and pollinate the almonds. And then after the almonds are done, we bring the bees to Washington for tree fruit pollination. And the tree fruit pollination, it's one of my favorite times of the year because all we get to do all day long is go through hives and check queens and check their feed stores and mark the ones that aren't good enough to go to the tree fruit for pollination and equalize the strengths. It's a lot of fun just playing in the bees all day long every day. And then at night you have to move them into the orchard, so that's not so fun. But so that's what we do in the spring. In the summertime, all the dividing is done. The bees are ready to go to make honey. So what we're doing right now is we're harvesting honey. We'll go out and after we've waited and waited and waited, finally the boxes are getting full, and we're going to go out and spend our days going to the outyards, taking off the honey, putting back on empty supers, bringing them the full supers back to the warehouse. And then one of my brothers, all he does is extract honey, and so he'll extract honey all day with the crew. And myself and more of my brothers will go out with crews in each in a different truck and visit several yards a day and bring in the honey. And as we do that, we're checking the bees, checking the queens, as we do every time we're into the hives. Then in the fall, we take off the last of the supers. We're applying mite treatments, again, checking the hives, especially looking for that they're queen right and that they have enough stores. We often with is feed honey for the ones that haven't filled up their brood nests enough. If you've seen hives in the fall, sometimes they put their honey in their supers and they leave the hive body itself kind of empty or light on honey. So we have to check them for feed as they go into winter. Pull out empty frames from the top box of the hive and put in honey, and might feed syrup again. Then in the winter in California, after we're done making our honey in the Dakotas, we go back to California for the winter and apply mite treatments, feed. The weather is somewhat good enough to check queens, but not terribly much. And there's not really a lot of queens available in November, December anyway. But that's our typical year. We're always in the bees.
And so how many hives is it that you have?
Right now, I think we have 16,000.
Wow.
We're
And
down a little bit. We've as you read in the news, hives are dying at higher rates than previous years, and we typically lose about a third of our hives in the course of a year. Some beekeepers claim they don't, but that's probably not an honest calculation. There's a strong bias among beekeepers, especially the large migratory ones, to claim that they don't have losses like everybody else. We do such a good job. And our losses of a third of our hives every year is an honest calculation. It's from the peak going into the summer. We have our most hives going into the summer for honey production versus what we can place in the almonds the following February. And that's our low number. And the difference is our loss. I know the BIP survey used to look at summer losses and then winter losses, but that's just our combined total annual loss, about 35%. And it varies by year, but it's a struggle to try to keep those numbers up. And we have a strong incentive to keep those hive numbers up because the almonds are such a lucrative project. If all the hives we can keep alive through to February that are strong enough to go to pollination in the almonds really is a huge benefit for us. And we'd keep them more alive if we could, if we only knew how. I am kind of jealous of the folks that keep 30 or 20 hives. I've got a friend down in Southeast Washington that he would keep 30, 35 hives, and he'd have one loss or zero losses of hives during the winter. And when he would lose a hive, he'd say, "Yeah, it was my fault. I did something dumb." I guess if I had a crew of 500 guys, maybe we'd get through the winter without any losses either. But we do a good job taking care of the bees, but I guess we could always do better, for sure.
so when do you move them from the Dakotas to California? And
We
what
start,
is that process like with 16,000 hives?
yeah. So we start at the end of October. There's some locations in California that are away from people. So we can come down at the end of October when it's still, in the 80s in California and drop a semi-load, 500 hives, and it won't bother the people because they're far enough away. So we start then, we do 2, 3 loads a week, and then by the middle of September, we're doing 5 or 6 loads a week. And then, excuse me, September, October. Yeah, if we start at the end of September, we ship all of October, and then by early November, we're shipping 6 and 7 loads a week. And we hope to be done around the 10th of November. It's like last year, I think it was 33 or 35 loads that we shipped altogether. We load them on a big flatbed semi and put a net over them and tie them down, and off they go. We've had really good luck over the years, though. Very few accidents when the bees are on the road.
Yeah,
every time in the news when there's a load of bees that crashes, it makes the national headlines, and everybody I know calls me, "Were those bees yours?" Nope, they're not ours.
that's good. Ellen and I picked up a bunch of hives at the side of the road here. Um, Not 16,000, but we had
Yeah.
four, so not, but a lot of angry bees and a big mess. Anyway, we do have a question. Someone wants to know what mite treatment you use most often.
Most often probably isn't the right way to think about it. You have to rotate your treatments. You don't want to let the mites get resistant to what you're using. Um, we rotate between ApiGuard, the Thymol gel treatment, Amitraz-based treatment. That's the Apivar strip. That the chemical is Amitraz, and we use oxalic acid. And what was the other thing? I don't remember what was that. We've experimented with all kinds of things, and I've had near our shop in North Dakota, I have a yard set aside for experiments. And I went in there with that brown sticky strip, the one that's hop guard, whatever that is, the hops beta acid, that strip, and the Apivar, Apistan, Kumafos, and one other thing, all in the same yard, trying to figure out what works best. And we've done tons and tons of experiments that way, but yeah, those are our main treatments. We rotate between them though. You can't have a main treatment um, because, like I say, the mites will get um, resistant. I guess if there was a main treatment that, I guess you could say main in the sense that it always works and isn't temperature dependent and isn't season dependent, is the Amitraz treatment. That works pretty much anytime you use it. Where Apivar, uh, well, Apivar, you can't really use it when they're clustered because if the strip doesn't happen to be where the cluster is, it doesn't work. The ApiGuard, the Thymol treatment, if it's cool, the time whatever stuff gel doesn't evaporate and get on the bees and do its job or whatever it is. That's temperature treatment. We did formic acid for a while, but we lost queens with that, and so we don't do formic acid anymore. And that again is temperature specific. You can't use it in the winter or when it's cool, and you can't use it when it's too hot either. Um, but I guess in the sense of the mainstay treatment we have, it would be the Amitraz. I guess I could talk about our rotation too. Typically, we will do Amitraz after the almonds, and then going into summer, we'll use oxalic acid. Since that's allowed to be used with the supers on, we'll do that. And then in the fall, we'll do ApiGuard, and then Amitraz again as needed. We have to look at our mite levels, though. Sometimes, uh, like I say, the ApiGuard, the Thymol treatment doesn't work right with the weather, may not be effective, and so you have to do post-treatment measurements of your mites so that you can know whether it was a success or not. You just can't put your treatment on and then walk away thinking you've taken care of the problem. It doesn't work that way.
And how do you keep track of all of that in terms of, keeping records about what you've used and what is working and what isn't working?
Um, well, as I explained, the temperature and the seasonality of some of the treatments, we used to use them in the most effective season in which they can be used. So it's like we with the Amitraz, we can use it almost any time, well, unless the supers are on, unless they're making honey, we can't use that then. And you really don't want to use ApiGuard either, the Thymol one, because it makes the honey taste funny. But you have to use them in the season in which they are best advantageous. So, whatever we can do to use them in the proper time. I was just speaking earlier today with a friend of mine in North Dakota who just got hired as an advisor to Greenlight Bioscience. They're the ones that have a RNA interference mite treatment. It's in final stages of EPA testing and may be available next year. And when he told me this news, I said, "Well, you've got to make sure that it remains viable in the hive more than an hour or two, because that's always been the problem with the RNAi treatments. The molecule is not stable in hive conditions. But there is good news, on the horizon. We have other mite treatments coming down the road, and RNAi is a possibility. People have tried before. When Jerry Hayes was at Monsanto, he tried to get it to work after Monsanto bought Biologics out of Israel, and they couldn't get it to stay in the hive to remain stable and viable in the hive very long. And so Monsanto dropped the project, but this Greenlight Biosciences has been working on it, and I hope they have improved the result since then.
We have another question. We have somebody who asks, how do you know what to charge for pollination services, and how long do you keep the hives in the crops?
So it's market based, really. You can't just off the cuff decide unless you're in a extremely geographically distant place. If you've got a captive audience, you can charge what you want. The economics of it are really interesting to me, actually. The almond pollination market, when my dad started keeping bees in the late 60s, he would go to California, and the first few years he put bees in the almonds just because it was good for the bees. And then the almonds were such a lucrative crop that they planted and they planted. And now there's, I think, 1.4 million acres of almonds in California, and they require 1 to 1.5 hives to the acre. And so they're pulling in hives from all over the continental US and even from Canada. I met a Canadian beekeeper in California who crossed the border illegally on a logging road up in the northern end of Washington to go to California for that big pollination income. But that demand that brings in bees from all over the country pushed the prices up. So now the market is $190 to $220 a hive for almond pollination, because if you don't pay that, you can't attract bees from all over the country. Now, tree fruit pollination in the Pacific Northwest is different. The bees are leaving the almond pollination, and they've got things they could do, things they don't have to do. So a lot of beekeepers like to go to Texas and Mississippi and build bees for summer honey production. So they'll skip tree fruit and seed and berry pollination in the Pacific Northwest. And others like us want to go up there and do that pollination. So that market is $50 to $70 a hive for tree fruit. And then berries are a little bit more because it's a little bit more work and longer bloom time later in the season. Today, I saw a load of bees going eastbound in Idaho. I think it was bees that had just been released from berry pollination heading to honey production in the Dakotas or Montana, probably Montana. And so the berries are a little bit more money to pollinate because it interferes with honey production. Our bees have been on location for honey production since middle of June, and just now in some places, I think the bees are coming out of the berry pollinations, at least in some places. So yeah, and then after that is the seed crops, and I'm not real familiar with how they price the seed crop pollination in Eastern Washington. They haven't done it for years, but it's mostly a market-driven thing, pollination prices. Did that answer the question?
Sorry, it takes me a little bit to get back on. I think so. Um, did that answer the question for the person that asked it? Hmm, I'm not seeing anything. Um, so, can you tell us a little bit about honey production and
Okay.
you know, extraction and selling honey?
Okay. Well, the extraction in the principle is the same as everybody else does it, I think. You know, you take the comb and you remove the capping and you spin the frame and the honey comes out. Um, we we just do
On
a
a
lot
bigger
of it.
scale.
Right, right. So I visited the extract plant of uh, the 80 Honey Company down in Bruce, South Dakota. And I think at one time they were the biggest beekeeper in the United States. And their extract plant is 4 Cowan systems where they're all you have a deboxer and it runs the frames through an uncapper, and then you have an air ram that pushes a whole rack of frames into a horizontal extractor, and it fills one of 4 banks of frames, and then you drop the lid. You get through a lot of frames really fast that way. Now, 4 of those systems running simultaneously seems like a really great idea to me. But my brother, who's in charge of extracting, is pretty old school, and he likes to do it the old-fashioned way. I don't know why. He's stubborn, I guess. But he just has these, radial, regular, 120 frame extractors that you load by hand. He does have um, the electronic boxes that control the motor so it speeds up slowly so it doesn't throw out the frames. If you turn it on full blast with the frames all full, the weight will just collapse the combs. So but he has 12 of those machines, and they all drain into a tank in the floor, and we have heat into that tank. It's a jacketed tank, so it helps keep the honey warm and the cappings float to the top. And then once it's sat there a while, we'll pump the honey off the bottom into a big tank um, above ground, and it'll sit longer, and more stuff will float to the top, and then we can drain it into drums. Almost all of our honey we sell by the semi-load in drums. We do sell a little bit of our own honey that we just put into jugs ourselves. My nieces and my daughters would do that job in the summertime. Um, but we only sell it to people who know that we have honey, or friends and neighbors and things. So it's not a whole lot. But yeah, that we only make honey really in the Dakotas. After the almonds, sometimes in California, we'll make a little bit of orange honey while the orange blossoms are going. But even that doesn't amount to a whole lot. So I've seen some of the really neat bottling machines, though, that beekeepers have. Even small beekeepers who sell their honey at farmers markets have really neat little bottling machines that meter out and fill quickly with the heated honey, and it comes out without bubbles, and it looks really nice. And I don't even have that. All the honey that we produce, and we can't bottle really. But I guess if I had more heads, I could wear more hats and get into bottling and approach local stores. There are lots of beekeepers who do.
Who do you sell your honey to mostly? And
Mostly, yeah. Our main buyer is Dutch Gold out of Pennsylvania. They sell up and down the East Coast. We also sell to Texas, to Florida, to Georgia, um, occasionally to Kansas, wherever we can get a good price. Um, there's kind of a bifurcated market going on in the U.S. price of honey. I don't know if you've ever taken the time to look at in the bee magazines, they have, the regional honey price report. And if you look, the North and South Dakota price is way lower than like West Coast, East Coast, California, Texas, all these other places are getting way more money. It's because all the honey is being produced in the upper Midwest. And so the packers know that and they won't give us a good price. But they want to see the beekeepers succeed in the rest of the country, I guess. And so they'll buy at a good price from them because it's not a whole lot of honey. But it's odd how it happens. I wish I could find an export market for our fine Dakota clover.
Is that how you find most of your potential buyers is through the bee magazines?
No, mainly it's word of mouth. Um, we just call around and a beekeeper might say, hey, I got a call from a packer who wanted some honey and I'm out. Do you have some? And here's the packer's name and number. Or they approach us and ask us, hey, I'm looking for this type of honey. Do you have any um, light amber? Or do you have any water white? And yes or no, or it's already committed to someone else. That's how we pretty much do our marketing. Um, it's it's not it's really word of mouth. It's very informal, and it's built on relationships too. Many years ago, we used to sell to a company in California that went bankrupt, and they ended up owing us a pretty good amount of money. We never got it, but the guy who used to work there, our contact there, went on and went to another packer, and at least he connected us to other packers who were looking for honey. So we were able to still market all our honey in spite of what we'd lost to that bankrupt business. Um, but he kind of did us a favor. He knew where this bankrupt company was hiding hordes and hordes of empty drums. They had imported a bunch of honey cheaply and packed it with a little bit of domestic honey and packed it as US grade A #1. And then all the empty drums they stashed out in this swamp. And so he said, go out there and grab all the barrels you want. So for one season, our bees would go to California from the Dakotas, and then they'd come back with empty barrels from California. And that was it was a real asset to us because, if you have to buy a drum, it could be $8, $12, $15. And our current agreements with our packers have barrel exchange policies, things like that, that help keep you in drums to fill. But our friend of ours that used to work for that bankrupt packer gave us the tip. And so we ended up having a big stockpile of drums to fill, and that gave us the flexibility to market our honey to new packers after that guy went bankrupt. And continue, because if you're making honey and it's filling your tanks and you've got nowhere to go with it after it's in your tanks, you're kind of stuck. So there's beekeeper Facebook pages where people advertise right now, I need drums, who can find me drums? And that was very fortunate and one good thing that came out of that bad situation for us.
Um, and we do have another question. One of the participants has asked, do you use USDA sheets? And maybe you could explain what those are, as well as answer the question.
Margo, you're breaking up some, but do we use USDA sheets? Is that the question?
Yes.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, me
Mm-mm.
either.
Yeah, maybe the questioner can answer that. It used to be that theoretically honey production facilities were inspected by USDA, but that was revoked here, less than 10 years ago. As a business, we're registered with True Source Honey, which is an industry group that tries to assure that the North American honey supply isn't adulterated and that it is sourced ethically. In other words, that it's not imported from a country that shouldn't be importing. And they used to require that we would be registered as a food processing facility with the FDA. But that requirement went away. But as far as USDA sheets, I don't know what that is.
The questioner says that it is something that the USDA publishes regarding pricing for pollination.
Like the NAS reports?
I don't
The
know. He says they're published annually.
Yeah, yeah, the National Ag Statistics Service does publish reports on pollination prices and honey prices. Dewey Karen and Ramesh Sagili in Oregon State have been doing for several years a Pacific Northwest pollination price report. They send out surveys to beekeepers in the Pacific Northwest asking what they're charging. So OSU, Oregon State, has that information through their pollinator plan.
But it sounds like you don't really pay that much attention to it.
Um, it's interesting, you know. I watch the prices, yeah. I pay attention to those for sure because I want to be able to argue with my packers as they say, "Oh, we're importing all the foreign honey we want. We don't want your honey. If we do want it, it's super cheap because we're getting all the foreign honey we want." And but right, the NAS honey price reports, I think they're monthly, and then they come out annually with a summary for the previous year's crop, and those are useful for sure. Yep. And then there's surveys of, I do quarterly colony loss surveys. I do annual beekeeping practice surveys. The NAS does a lot. They ask us for a lot of information. The cost of keeping a hive alive, the cost of keeping bees for the year. They have surveys on that. So all that information's out there. Pollinator price, well, yeah, pollination prices, all that stuff the information's available for those who want it.
Okay. And how much honey do you produce annually? Did we get an answer to that question?
Annually, it really varies. Um, so we run 16 to 18,000 hives for honey production. And some years, our average, I think, average honey production was 65 pounds a hive. Um, it had been, but it's been lower lately. Our very best year was 2014 at 150 pounds a hive. Now, I fully know that folks who keep 1, 2, 3, 5 hives can make way more than 150 pounds in a year. If they're paying attention and doing their best, it's not unheard of at all. 300 pounds is doable on a hive that you're tending with care and frequently. But our best year was 150 pounds, and that's the honest average across all the hives. And that includes, the ones that didn't do well or that died or uh, had queen problems, whatever. So yeah, that's like 40 pounds is a poor year. 60, 65 pounds is about average. I think our worst year ever was, boy, I want to say like 30 pounds. And you're not even covering the cost of transportation at that price. Moving bees between states is like hauling cattle. It's very expensive. Well, it is livestock after all. So we're paying $5.50 a mile to move these bees between states on a semi. Years ago, we used to have our own trucks and our own drivers, and that worked real well. But finding good people to do that is hard. And so we have good people to do it, just that they're owner operators and they drive their own trucks and we pay them so well they take the rest of the year off until they're ready to haul for us again.
So, I mean, one of the problems that we have as hobbyist beekeepers is having enough food for the bees to overwinter. That's not, is that something that you're concerned about, or do they have enough when they get to, is there enough available to them in California when you get them down there?
There's literally nothing in California when they get there. The very earliest bees might get a little bit of a little flower they call blue curl, but that, and we're in the Central Valley with our bees of California near Fresno, and that's very limited and really they're going to California for the climate, for overwintering, and because that's where they'll need to be for the almonds in February. Now, there's a lot of beekeepers who store their bees indoors, and I think it's a great idea, and I'd love to do it more. I just need to convince my partners, my brothers, that we should do it more. But we've done experiments with it. We've done indoor storage in Idaho and in Utah, both, and I thought the results were good. Um, my brothers told me that they would get the same amount of live hives off the semi load that went to California and spent the winter feeding and medicating and checking as they would a load of hives that spent the winter in Utah in a building that came down, and they go through them, pull off the dead outs and put them in the almond. They get the same amount of live hives. So it seems to me that we should do that, but I'm not the boss. It's a partnership. So I'm, but yeah, um, as far as our uh, feed goes for the winter, once they get to California, it's warm enough for them to take sugar syrup, so they can be fed more. Also, in North Dakota, while we're harvesting our honey, sometimes the supers come in with frames that are maybe this year's foundation, that's brand new frame that's full of honey. It's really quite fragile that you don't want to put in the extractor. And we'll set those aside and take them to Washington or California and then feed them back to the bees as they need actual honey. The bees can't live on sugar syrup alone. They have to have actual honey. And so we'll save back a portion of the honey that they produce in the current summer to give back to them again in the spring or early summer in the dearth before the honey flow starts again in the Midwest.
Okay, we have another question. Somebody asks, what kind of advice do you have for someone who's starting out as a sideliner?
Um, well, I mentioned earlier my friend that used to be a butcher at Safeway. He had enough bees to where he could get his beekeeping done on a Saturday, and or between two Saturdays. It helped him to be friends with beekeepers who were going to California because he would send his bees to California. He didn't go himself, but he was able to send his bees to California, and he would go through the almonds. He'd get the revenue. He'd give part of it to the beekeeper who took him down and brought him back. And then he'd get back from the almonds these booming hives that are ready to divide. Um, and that's kind of why my dad went to the almonds originally, because they do so well. Almonds produce pollen that's nutritious for bees, and the nectar that comes in is garbage, but it's nectar. If you've ever had almond honey, it is bitter, it's terrible, it'll make you gag, but the bees store it and it can live on it. Um, so yeah, as a sideliner, you should probably get acquainted with a commercial beekeeper who can take your bees to the almonds for you if you want to do that. And if you don't, being a friend with a commercial beekeeper, they often will get bulk deals on feed, and you might be able to get some of the feed for your bees on their bulk deals. Some beekeepers buy table sugar, sucrose, by the semi-load and mix it themselves with water. Others buy corn syrup by the tanker load and store it and use it as needed. And being a friend with a commercial beekeeper who can help in that way, it would be good. Often a small beekeeper or sideliner might need 10 or 15 queens for five. And it's hard to get the queen producers sometimes to pay attention to an order that small. Or if you're friends with a commercial beekeeper, they buy queens by the hundred. And if they're a little long, they might be able to, sell you a few of the ones that they have. Um, the sideliner thing though, it's if I weren't a beekeeper, I mean, if I weren't a full-time beekeeper, I would probably still be a sideliner, and I think it would be a lot of fun. A sideliner would really have to have some good locations, some locations that don't get sprayed, some locations where they won't bother people, and where they'll bring in nectar and pollen. That's kind of vital, really. It's such a huge savings if you can have a location where they'll bring in nectar and pollen most of the year. That's huge. The whole North Dakota thing that we have to do, we have too many bees to stay in Washington. There's just not forage in the state for that many hives. And for all the hives that come for tree fruit and seed and berry pollination, we have to leave. If we stayed, all the bees would starve. And we're kind of seeing that now on the east side around Spokane, around Walla Walla. Some beekeepers who are coming out of pollination contracts just plop their bees down someplace, eat up all the forage, where sideliner or small beekeepers have kept their bees traditionally for years. And they plop down 100 here, 100 there, 200 here. And all they're hoping for is not have to feed them. They don't care if they make a honey crop. They just don't want to have to feed them. It's a cost savings to them. It's ruining it for everybody else. So for the sideliner, really ought to scout out some locations, get acquainted with landowners who have land that doesn't have bees on it already. And yeah, that would be big for a sideliner. However many hives you want to have, boy, the saying I think is for hobbyists, they ought to have at least two or three, because if one hive goes skiwampus, you've got two more hives to draw eggs out of or brood or whatever, make queen cells from. A sideliner, 15, 20, 100. It's hard to tell how many a person can comfortably take care of. Um, one thing that's kind of changed in the past. So I kept bees before Varroa. I'm that old, and swarming was a huge problem pre-Varroa. Post-Varroa, not a problem for commercial beekeepers, because Varroa, the viruses they vector, pesticides, pathogens, all that stuff combines, and we're seeing the 35% loss annually. And so we spend our springs dividing the hives that survived to make new hives, and they never get strong enough to swarm, at least for a commercial beekeeper who's trying to build their numbers back. So a sideliner kind of needs to stay on top of their hives. If they have 30 or 100, you don't want to have more hives than you can take care of comfortably. I have friends that work in jobs that are 410s, Monday through Thursday, 10 hours a day. That would leave them 3-day weekends. And you could have quite a few bees if you were a sideliner with 3 straight days to take care of your bees. Unless you have a life outside of your 410s and your bees, then you don't have 3 straight days. But yeah, the sideliner should pick up as many hives as they're comfortable with. Start small and get as big as you think you can be. And don't be afraid to make hives and sell them. When I was young in the US, honey was the #1 income producing product for beekeepers, followed by pollination. And a few years ago, pollination now brings in more revenue for beekeepers than honey does. And just recently, pollination is still the #1 revenue source for beekeepers, but selling queens and bees is now #2 above honey. In other words, there's a lot of beekeepers who want to have large numbers of hives for the almonds that are willing to buy lots of queens and lots of splits or divides. And beekeepers can make a living not worrying about honey production. If they have the yards to support honeybee health, they can make divides all spring and into the early summer and sell those. So that's another thing that a sideliner could do: raise their own queens and sell milks, and not have to be bothered with the honey thing, since honey seems to be not as valuable as it once was.
We have another long question here. Is there an entity that polices or oversees the various commercial beekeepers and their moving and overwintering of bees? There have been incidents of commercial beekeeper outfits overwintering their bees in Whatcom County with no overseeing of the upkeep or maintenance of the hives. How does your business handle the bad apples that could be giving your profession a bad name with the public?
Um, the circles I run in, I don't hear that from anybody I know. I'm familiar with the situation mentioned up in Whatcom, and there are bad apples. Um, my first suggestion is if a beekeeper is behaving poorly, they should be um, they should be reported to the sheriff for either not having permission to have their bees in a location. Um, if they're causing a nuisance, there's nuisance laws. Our liability bill protects beekeepers when they're keeping bees, as long as they are registered with the state and abiding by zoning rules about bee placement. If your local zoning law says you can have up to 5 hives in a backyard, if you have 6, you're not protected from liability. And so, if a person has 100 hives right next to a preschool, that's not going to fly, and the sheriff should definitely be informed. As far as monitoring beekeeping practices, even in those states that are heavily regulated, Washington used to be heavily regulated. Um, Several states still are. Really, the only thing the state can mandate or ever is quarantine AFB hives, uh, quarantine or destroy AFB, or quarantine. For a time, it was tracheal mites, were the supposed new big bugbear, and hives were quarantined. And but as far as practices go, I've never heard of, even in heavily regulated Washington years ago, they didn't really monitor practices much. Abandoned apiaries, yes, the state would come in and declare it abandoned and have it destroyed, but it has to be literally abandoned. Dead hives full of fowl, then yeah, the state would order them destroyed. So, right, as far as I hope that the poor managing beekeepers who don't take care of their hives will go out of business. That's what should happen. When Varroa came, the not diligent beekeepers soon were out of business. You had to be on top of those mites, or you didn't have bees anymore. I recall some bees we bought from a fella. He didn't know anything about mites and didn't want to know anything about mites, so he was getting out of the bees. And we bought all of his bees. It was a few hundred hives, and about a third of them were dead, and the 2/3 were some of the best bees I'd ever seen, because he didn't do anything with them. They built and built and swarmed and built and built, and it was crazy how heavy and big they were. The boxes were falling apart, but the hives, the bees, the brood, the populations were gigantic. And so, I think the poor beekeepers sooner or later are going to have to go away, just because they can't stay in business. But yeah, definitely involve the sheriff in any concerns with placement of hives. If the landowner isn't willing to step up and ask the poorly behaving beekeeper to leave.
So we're almost an hour in, and I think that that the questions have kind of petered out. But if anyone who's on has another question, please put it into um, the chat, and I'll get it out there. But maybe you could spend the last few minutes, Tim, talking about some of the positives and some of the challenges of that you see going forward in the beekeeping business.
Um, Challenges. Well, on the national level, we've had great support from the federal government for research. It's just been great. We've gotten a new lab in Stoneville, Georgia, a new USDA ARS lab, in addition to Tucson and Beltsville, and the new lab not too many years ago down in UC Davis. And so the funding is there for research. That's a good thing. Another good thing would be that we're making progress. I mentioned the RNAi mite treatment earlier. Brandon Hopkins at WSU has done a lot of work in getting indoor storage to be more mainstream. And I think that a lot of beekeepers are doing it now, and I think it's helped them. And that's a positive. Challenges, though. Challenges on the national level, some of them are imports of foreign honey. So the problem is that China when was it? The late 80s, early 90s had been dumping honey on the American market for ridiculously low prices, and it was destroying the domestic price. Well, the packers would say, I can get all the Chinese honey I want. I don't care. You American producers, take this price or just don't sell your honey. And so the beekeepers at the time banded together and brought a suit before the International Trade Court, the Department of Commerce, accusing the Chinese of dumping honey on the American market. And they found in the beekeepers' favor. And so they imposed a gigantic tariff on Chinese imports. And that brought the domestic price of honey way up. And that tariff is still in place. And so for a while, the Chinese were transshipping their honey through third-party countries like Taiwan, India, Vietnam, Malaysia, and then it would be sold to the U.S. as a product of Taiwan, India, Malaysia, having actually come from China, by way of the third party. And so U.S. and Customs and Border Protection have been trying to crack down on that, and there's been some progress. And now what the Chinese have done is they have, part of the reason they're able to export such gigantic amounts of honey is that they have a lot of natural land that lets them make honey, but they harvest the honey while it's still nectar. They harvest it as fast as they can, and they put it into a vacuum drying machine that artificially removes the moisture, and then sell it as honey when it's more like a syrup. The European Food Agency, forget the name of it, their policy is that honey must be produced by bees, not by artificial means. And so vacuum drying of honey isn't allowed in Europe. But they import a lot of Chinese honey too, and I think that there's a certain amount of misdirection going on there. And that technology has been exported to the rest of Asia. So Vietnam and India, especially India, they're kind of in the same boat as China. They have a very warm climate with lots of moisture, and they are able to produce massive amounts of nectar. But it's so humid that it takes forever for their bees. They never cap their honey, hardly ever. And so they harvest it as nectar, and they put it through these artificial machines that extract the moisture from this nectar, and then it becomes honey and sell it to the US market. It's not bad for people to eat that stuff, but it's not honey either. The US government hasn't been able to come to a acceptable conclusion on what the definition of honey is, and it's a challenge. We're trying to get the Customs and Border Protection to put a standard of identity for honey, which doesn't exist yet in the US. So imports from these countries are still driving the US price down. So that's a challenge. Varroa remains a challenge. Tropolalaps mercedese is also going to be a challenge sometime. We're not sure how much of a challenge it will be. There's this is the mite that lives in Korea and in Asia right now. And the Washington State Department of Agriculture has sent people over there to study that mite in its natural habitat to be acquainted with it before it arrives. We think it probably will arrive just like the Asian giant hornet arrived. So the Tropolalaps mite could be very dangerous for beekeepers, but the jury's not out. It might be that they don't survive on adult bees. So an extended broodless period may clean a hive out of the trophy mite. We don't know. There's different opinions on that. Different scientists have different ideas. It may be that in the Asian area that the trophy mite survives on other animals outside of bees when the bees go broodless. And they may not have such animals here. We don't know. But that's a concern on the horizon. So, and then rising CO2 levels is going to decrease the nutrition of pollen, and it's going to decrease the sugar concentration in nectar. So those are challenges we're going to have to adapt to. So there's challenges and there's positive aspects both, and we have to do our best and stay abreast of the research and do the best we can in the meantime to keep our bees alive.
Terrific. Does anyone have any other questions? Ellen, do you have any questions?
Real good program, Tim. I thank you very, very much. I was wondering, I've heard you tell some really good stories about your life with beekeeping, and what's your most memorable story?
Most memorable story. Oh, I remember being a little kid. My mom took me down to the shop. I was probably 5 or 6, maybe. And I was supposed to go in and get my dad to come out and tell my mom something. And I walked into this shop, and the shop is where my dad would extract, he and his guys. And the shop is probably 40 by 50 feet. And I walked in, and I walked into honey on the floor. And I looked, and the whole floor had honey on it. And my dad saw me and said some words that I won't repeat here. Somebody he was filling drums and walked away and left the gate open on the tank. It just made a huge mess. So that's something I'll not forget, because that was quite a sight to see that many square feet of honey on the floor.
I'm sure, have you done that? I've done that. Not a gallon, 55-gallon drum, but quart jars. I've walked away and come back, and there's honey all over the place.
Right. So when we're pumping our honey out of the tank that collects from the extractors, it pumps, we turn on the pumps, and it goes into a tank up high enough to where you can put a drum underneath it to fill the drum. And for years, we have 3 of those large tanks. And for years, my brother would put a beach ball in the tank. And so you could see the beach ball, it meant shut off the pump. And more than once, so the beach ball floats to the far side of the tank and you can't see it. Then it's coming over the top and down the side of the tank and onto the floor. But no, one of the cool things, though, I've enjoyed my associations with the friends I've met at WASBA, and one of the cool things was getting acquainted with a fellow who worked for an electronics or electric component distributor whose wife was a beekeeper, and he was interested enough. I explained the problem to him, and he designed I think it was infrared, or I don't remember. He designed a thing that had a sensor in it that I could set the depth, and I could stick it on the top of the tanks, and it would make a light up and an alarm sound go off. So And we've been using that thing constantly. He designed it, he spec'd the parts, I assembled it, it works. It's been so cool to have met that fellow, Charlie, and prevent that problem from happening again. So that, yeah, you can learn a lot from being in an association, in a club. You share your knowledge and your expertise, and do people a lot of good.
Well, I don't see any other questions, so I think I'm going to actually share the screen. I hope, maybe not. I'm going to I'll put the link to the website so that people can get information about the conference if they're interested. If you'll just bear with me 1 minute. And then I think that we will sign off. Just 1 moment.
I'm looking forward to the conference. Randy Oliver will be there. I'm looking forward to seeing him again. And
Yeah, he's always good.
yeah, he is very knowledgeable and can talk bees to anybody. He's great. It should be a great conference. I'll be coming back from the Dakotas for it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much for participating. If you want to see yourself again, this should be posted as a video shortly. And I think that Ellen is going to make me turn this and other of our videos into YouTube videos, so you might be able to see yourself there. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot.